So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's the director of the Earth Institute here at Columbia University. He's a Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Public Policy and Management at Columbia. He's a special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals, and he held that same position under the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He's the director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the co-founder and chief strategist of the Middleincome Alliance, and the director of the Millennium Villages Project. He's authored 3 New York Times bestsellers in the past 7 years. Please welcome Jeff Sachs.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I think it was very, very impressive to see all of the different constituencies from science, social science, policy making, NGO community, U.S. and abroad, and that really is the purpose of our gathering today. And it was also wonderful to hear about the history of this field and also the pioneering work of the leaders of the last panel, which indeed has been pioneering and, as we heard, against the odds at many points. But clearly, with great success, not only scientific success, but the fact that the term El Niño is everywhere this year, and it is in common circulation. It is widely understood that this is a special destabilized year. It is something that was not the case even 10 or 15 years ago. And this is the success of the work of so many people in this room, and very, very important work. It's all the more important because, as we know, and it's been the theme of IRI from the very start, we can do something about this knowledge by looking ahead, by understanding the consequences and the implications. It's possible to have at least some responses that are timely and some approaches that build resilience. I want to talk about what this big El Niño might mean for the world economy. Forecasting anything about the world economy is even, of course, more hazardous than forecasting an El Niño itself. The human systems are less predictable, more multidimensional, and defining the stakes of a world economy and therefore its vulnerabilities to El Niño related disturbances is not a simple matter. But it is the case, and I think for a lot of reasons that we can understand, that several of the big El Niños have been associated with very big global economic disturbances. I entered this field as a student in 1972-73, and actually one of the first talks I ever heard was Lester Thoreau giving a talk about the disappearance of the anchovies off the coast of Peru and its implications for the world economy. And that was quite a notable memory for me listening in 1973 as a sophomore in college. And it is the case that 1972-73, which was a major El Niño, though not the biggest, was also a period of remarkable global economic instability. Then it happened again in 1982-83, that at least the simple correlation of another big El Niño and another rather shocking global macroeconomic period occurred. The 82-83 years were the onset of a major macro crisis, which I'll describe in a moment. Then the next giant El Nino, 1997-98, was another big year of global macroeconomic disturbance. That was the so-called Asian financial crisis year. And there were clearly countries like Indonesia that were implicated in both the El Nino crisis and massively in the financial crisis. So these were three big El Ninos associated with three big periods of years of global macroeconomic destabilization. Of course, it's easy to find years of big El Ninos that were not major macroeconomic upheavals, and it's possible to find years of major macroeconomic upheavals, notably 2008, which were not El Nino years, so nobody should expect or search for a highly tightly coupled system. Human events of all sorts, geopolitical and geoeconomic, have multiple drivers and multiple causes. El Nino events can be part of that, but by no means are they the only possible drivers, even not necessarily the major ones. Yet, it's striking, and I have worried for years myself that the next big El Nino would be another big global macroeconomic upheaval, and we're now in the middle of a big El Nino, and we could be in the middle of another big macroeconomic upheaval. It's very early to say, but there are definitely some reasons for worry. We've learned a lot about the economic channels of an El Nino locally, and it's now understood, thanks to the ocean science, that the teleconnections of an El Nino are significant in most parts of the tropical world, and most parts of the tropical world have multiple channels of vulnerability to El Nino-related weather disturbances. And so a short list, which is not conclusive by any means or fully inclusive, would include the onset of infectious disease epidemics, certainly other public health crises, heat waves, local air pollution, the peat burning, which is destabilizing Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore right now, clearly El Nino related. Tremendous risks to a wide variety of crop systems and livestock systems. We have a lot of evidence now of temporal correlation and plausible causation with local violence that comes from usually water stress or food stress or livestock stress environments, almost all in the very low income settings where there are no buffers to these kinds of shocks. Of course, extreme storms of various kinds. A theorized and statistically observed loss of work productivity in years of exceptional temperature anomalies, which of course are driven in part by El Nino or ENSO fluctuations. Energy crises, reservoirs, water reservoirs, hydropower put into crisis by ENSO-related droughts. So there are plenty of local channels, and I think without question any major El Nino is going to have a lot of local effects, and those are already being experienced. Necessarily tying the link of a specific climatic event such as the Ethiopian drought that's underway right now, which is a very, very severe drought, to the El Nino is also a piece of statistical reasoning that isn't conclusive, but we're seeing a lot of upheavals. A lot of them seem to be El Nino teleconnections, and the channels by which they affect especially low-income countries are multiple, convincing, and potentially destabilizing. How can this turn into macroeconomic risk at the global scale as opposed to local shocks? Of course, the main way is through the correlation of local shocks that are driven by the common ENSO signal. And so simultaneous crop failures in a number of parts of the world, or simultaneous ENSO emergencies in low-income countries, are one of the main triggers. And that's especially true if they lead to some kind of political crisis. So what makes these El Niños potentially more than economic hardship alone, which of course would be important and interesting, and turning them into more general crises, is if the hardships then turn into political crises, and if the political crises somehow spread. And this is especially notable in a world that's already at its capacity to deal with political crises, which is one of the points of 2015. We're already filled with problems right now, and so like any kind of anomaly, the effect of that anomaly depends on the underlying state of geopolitics and the world economy, and the possibility of an amplified war in ENSO-related regions or geopolitical crisis resulting from that, I think is real. The second way that ENSO can have an effect is in the larger economies, especially the middle income or so-called emerging economies, though emerging sounds too optimistic for some of them right now. But unlike a very poor country, which is so agriculturally dependent that an ENSO effect has a huge effect on the economy, a middle-income country will typically not be so vulnerable to climate-related shocks per se, because a lot more of the economy is outside of agriculture, outside of direct physical dependence on climate conditions. But if those economies are already in a state of stress, then an ENSO shock can be an amplifier or creating a tipping point in those economies that create other kinds of economic events that are significant. And I think a classic example of this would be Indonesia in 1997, which was in political crisis, in economic vulnerability. In 1997, a financial crisis began in the Southeast Asian region. It began in Thailand, but because of the nature of international financial markets and how vulnerable they are to contagion, it quickly spread throughout the entire ASEAN region and even into Northeast Asia. And then the El Niño hit Indonesia, so it was a period of forest fires, displacement, and so forth. And suddenly you had a confluence of events, of which El Niño was an aggravator, not the main event. But Jakarta and other parts of the country went up in flames, not El Niño-related flames, but protest flames, to banking crisis, a financial crisis, and difficulties in the countryside. And that's when Suharto fell, that spring fell from power. So I have no doubt, looking at that while you could not disentangle statistically the exact effect of the El Niño, it was absolutely one of the very complicating factors that year that led to the onset of a rather large, though still national scale political event. One can say the same thing about almost any climate related shock in a middle income setting. And recently, as Mark and others have been writing about the drought in Syria in the mid-2000s, you would not say that today's Syria crisis was really caused by drought, but you would definitely want to say that today's Syrian bloodbath was stoked and aggravated by drought, and the drought was one of the factors that may have created the tipping point to huge instability. And the argument would be something like drought displacing the local populations in rural areas in Syria between 2006 and 2009. When the Arab Spring protests started in early 2011, and probably with a bit of provoking by the CIA as well, protests started in Syria, and the displaced populations were part of the unrest. Rising food prices were part of the unrest. So the fingerprint of food crisis was definitely there in the early stages. When the Assad regime cracked down on these protests violently in April and May 2011, that then led to a set of geopolitical events, especially the US, CIA, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, deciding to fund an insurgency against the regime. And we have in 2015 a full bloodbath that is a complete geopolitical disaster at this point and one of the flashpoints on the planet. And so you can look at that and say, what did the drought do? The drought was not the sole cause by any means of this crisis, but it was definitely one of the factors that contributed to its timing and its onset. Probably not to its severity in the sense of a geopolitical crisis. That took armies, military interventions, geopolitics to do, but for life on the ground that led to the displacements in population and subsequent unrest, I think it surely played a role. So if we're looking for fingerprints for a global crisis or a tropics crisis or a big regional crisis coming from El Nino, I would distinguish two different kinds of crises. One is crises hitting very poor countries that are basically rural, agricultural, weather dependent, with very little buffering at all to shocks, and a lot of instability that, and certainly a lot of misery that can arise from that. Those kinds of crises can lead to local conflict. They can lead to even war. They by themselves won't be world destabilizing events or macro scale events by themselves, because the poor remote areas are generally too insignificant to the world economy to have that kind of effect. But they can trigger involvement by larger powers, and then you get an amplifying effect. The more significant direct economic effects would come in middle-income countries. And when I look back at 72, 73, or 82, 83, or 97, 98, you can argue that in a number of the larger middle-income countries, whether it's Mexico or Brazil or Indonesia or others that have some systemic weight, that El Nino forcings were part of the instability that affected those countries those years. Never big enough by itself to say that's the macroeconomic effect, because the macroeconomic effect of an El Nino, if there are heavy impacts on precipitation that come from a big El Nino that reach into this region, it's definitely hitting a place of existing instability that is primed for unexpected feedbacks. So that's one effect to look for. A second is in financial markets. Financial markets, as we've all noticed in the last 25 years, are positive feedback processes. That means they're filled with bubbles and bursting bubbles. and they're subject to very abrupt state changes that we call financial panics. 2008 was such a state change where large capital flows suddenly stopped and were reversed with the failure of Lehman Brothers. And we're not, well, we don't know actually. You never know with the financial markets because we're just not good enough at understanding the underlying risks. And there's a lot of false optimism that is part of the Muzak of the world financial system that distracts us from underlying risks. But there are some reasons for worry about the state of the financial system, and one of them is that a period of very easy credit that followed 2008, that was in fact the response to the 2008 financial crisis, is ending within days, because the Federal Reserve Board will start raising interest rates, and while this is one of the most advertised and delayed events in recent monetary history, it's going to happen, and it can have effects that are not well understood. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible that it starts setting up some strong amplifying capital reversals. The reason financial markets have this positive feedback effect is that if you start calling in loans to banks and the banks become illiquid, they start calling in their own loans, and so you get a kind of financial run as a possible outcome of tighter credit conditions. And with the Fed about to end 7 years of low interest rates, or 7 years of falling interest rates or near zero interest rates and starting to raise interest rates, that could destabilize at least some countries. And if those countries are simultaneously being hit by El Nino related events, that could prove to be a surprise, an adverse surprise. Third is that the engine of growth for a lot of the tropics of the last 20 years has been China. China has been the vast purchaser of mineral commodities and agricultural products that have driven up the terms of trade of the commodity-based low and middle income countries, of which Africa and Latin America are, and also some parts of Southeast Asia, are highly dependent. And China has slowed markedly, though it's debated by how much, in the last couple of years, and commodities prices have come way down. Now, in past El Niños, we worried about the El Nino channel being a sharp spike of commodities prices. This is somewhat unlikely right now because of a glut of primary commodities that has resulted from China's slowdown. But on the other hand, it's left a lot of countries in weak fiscal and financial conditions. So most of Latin America has experienced a significant slowdown, of growth. And now if an El Nino impacts as well, that's in a more vulnerable position. The same is true with significant parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. So that's a third factor that should be taken into account, and that's what I put at the bottom, low terms of trade or weakening terms of trade. So what are possible flashpoints that could turn this big El Nino into a global macro event? One, I would say, is the Middle East, but you have to tell us whether the signals are likely to be significant in North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, but that's one continuing 7,000 kilometer crisis zone from Libya to Afghanistan. And if El Nino were to have a serious impact there, it would be profoundly destabilizing worldwide. Second is ASEAN, which is definitely in the epicenter of an El Nino impact. I don't think Indonesia is vulnerable this year the same way as in 1997, but it's being hard hit. And the whole region is in a state of difficulty because of low terms of trade and geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea. So none of it would be easy with a very heavy El Nino impact. The Horn of Africa is in major drought. Ethiopia is experiencing its worst drought in decades, and this is definitely a region that's filled with potential instability. Southern Africa is now entering a hunger phase, El Nino related, and that's another possible flashpoint for global instability. And finally, in South America, you have the end of a long wave of South American robust development. Brazil is in political and economic crisis right now. The Andean region has slowed. Again, I don't see a global macro crisis, but I wouldn't say the conditions are favorable, and these are places likely to be El Nino impacted. So that is, I think, as best as one can say, that we can expect significant local pain resulting from this El Nino. I think there's no doubt about that. We will see pockets of significant pain. Whether it amplifies to a more global macroeconomic crisis really depends on it being a tipping point to other vulnerabilities. And we can see several regions where that is at least